If we could journey back in time and pose the query to the initial followers of Christianity in the 1st century, concerning the demise of Judas Iscariot, we might receive varying accounts, that he hanged himself, plummeted headfirst to his death, or swelled until he burst open. Within the New Testament writings alone, we encounter a couple of these renditions. Moreover, there exists a third narrative, widely circulated both in antiquity and during the medieval period, despite its exclusion from the Bible. In this exploration, we will meticulously examine each of these versions, delving into how ancient scholars interpreted and endeavored to harmonize these disparate accounts of Judas's death. With that acknowledgement, let us delve into the 3 accounts of Judas's death. We shall commence with the first version, perhaps the most widely recognized, as it appears in the Gospel of Matthew. According to this Gospel, Judas received 30 silver coins from the chief priests in exchange for betraying Jesus. However, upon witnessing the trial and condemnation of his master, Judas experienced profound remorse. He returned to the temple to return the coins. Yet, upon his arrival, the chief priests refused to accept the money back. Consequently, Judas hurled the coins onto the temple floor and departed to hang himself. In response, those who had provided Judas with the coins determined that, given that the money represented blood money, as the text states, funds used to commission a death, implicated in an immoral act, they could not deposit it into the temple treasury, which was considered sacred. However, they could utilize the coins to purchase a plot of land, which they did, acquiring what became known as the Potter's Field. They designated this land as a burial ground for foreigners. According to the text, it was due to this transaction that the land became known as the Field of Blood. Therefore, this initial account of Judas Iscariot's death suggests that he took his own life by hanging after betraying Jesus. The coins he returned were used to acquire a plot of land, subsequently known as the Field of Blood, precisely because it was purchased with the price of blood, the payment for his treachery. However, this is not the sole version of Judas's death presented in the Bible, nor is it the only explanation provided for the name of this land, the Field of Blood. In the book of Acts, which unfolds after the death and resurrection of Jesus, a scene depicts the Apostle Peter delivering a speech before hundreds of other disciples. Peter explains that they must select a replacement. Regarding the vacancy left by Judas, the aim was to restore the original number of 12 apostles, the inner circle surrounding Jesus, after Judas's death had reduced their count to 11. In his address, Peter recounts the final days of Judas, stating, according to the book of Acts, that Judas, following his betrayal of Jesus, acquired a field with the wages of his wrongdoing, specifically the coins he received for his treachery. In this field, Judas purportedly fell head first, rupturing in the middle, resulting in his entrails spilling onto the ground. This is quite a bizarre image to envision cinematically, considering the sequence of actions that led to Judas's midsection bursting open after a headlong fall. We will explore this matter in greater depth later. Continuing with Peter's account, he adds that the manner of Judas's death became widely known among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so much so that the field where Judas died was named Aceldama, in their language, meaning field of blood. Thus, in the version presented in the book of Acts, Judas did not return the money to the priests, and consequently, they did not purchase any land with it. Instead, according to the author of Acts, Peter states that Judas himself bought the land and ultimately met his end there in a rather enigmatic way. He fell headfirst, and for some unexplained reason, his body split open upon impact. This fall was exceptionally gruesome, so much so that the location became known as the Field of Blood because of it. This account offers a different explanation for the name of the field compared to the Gospel of Matthew. We will soon revisit how some ancient authors attempted to reconcile these discrepancies. However, before that, we must examine what I consider to be the most striking version of Judas's death, as recorded by an early Christian leader who may have even known the Apostle John. This figure is Papias of Hierapolis, who lived between the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon refers to him as a man of the early period and a listener of the elders, someone who heard about the events of Jesus' time directly from the first Christians and even from a certain John, possibly a reference to the Apostle John. So, what does Papias say about the death of Judas? Actually, we have two versions of it, a shorter one and a longer one. Papias wrote a 5-volume work called Exposition of the Sayings of the Lord, but this work has been lost to time. No original manuscripts of it have survived. However, while the work was still extant, it was widely read and cited by various ancient authors. Consequently, we have fragments of it preserved in other books that have survived. One such instance is Papias's account of Judas's death, which is cited in both a shorter and a longer form by Apollinaris of Laodicea, a bishop of the initial century. Provides an account indicating that, stemming from Judas's wickedness, his physique commenced to swell and become inflamed to such an extent that, according to Papias's concise rendition, he broadened to exceed the width of a wagon. In this abridged form, the narrative details how this bloated Judas was violently run over by a chariot, scattering his internal organs in every direction. Conversely, the extended version omits the chariot incident but compensates by incorporating several gruesome particulars concerning Judas's final days. Here, the details become exceedingly revolting. Should you wish to bypass this segment, you may proceed to the chapter markers in the video description and advance to the subsequent section. Now, according to Papias's more detailed account, Judas underwent a complete distension, mirroring the shorter iteration. His head expanded to the point of surpassing a wagon's width, rendering him sightless as his eyes were effectively buried beneath the mass his head had become. Even medical professionals, employing specialized instruments, found themselves unable to access his eyes due to the sheer magnitude of the swelling. Furthermore, his genitalia experienced a similarly immense enlargement, and each attempt to relieve himself resulted in the expulsion of pus and worms alongside his urine. This condition persisted for a considerable duration, causing him immense suffering, until his eventual demise. Papias pointedly identifies the location of his death, stating that he died, quote, on his own land, unquote, signifying the property he had acquired. This land remained entirely desolate and uninhabitable from that moment onward, owing to the overpowering stench of putrid discharge emanating from Judas's body, which permeated the soil. The text further asserts that, even up to the time of its writing, passage near this site was impossible without covering one's nose. Therefore, these constitute the versions attributed to Papias. At least two noteworthy aspects emerge from these accounts. The first is that, yet again, Judas's death is linked to and provides an explanation for a characteristic of a plot of land. In this instance, it's not the land's name that the story elucidates, but its pervasive odor or its generally derelict state. Secondly, despite the apparent outlandishness of these narratives, they do not markedly deviate from other texts originating from comparable contexts. They bear resemblance, in various respects, to descriptions such as the death of Antiochus IV, recounted in the second book of Maccabees, the demise of Herod Agrippa as chronicled by Flavius Josephus, and the passing of Emperor Galerius, as narrated by Eusebius of Caesarea. In all these depictions of the deaths of villains, so to speak, the bodies of these figures swell, generate worms, and are riddled with ulcers or sores affecting their intestines and internal organs, ultimately leading to their perishing. In each of these instances, divine retribution manifests as a physically repulsive death. For those wishing to examine these accounts directly, simply rewind the video and pause at the points where the relevant texts appear. These, then, are the versions offered by Papias, which, as you've observed, diverge. One includes being run over as the cause of death, while the other does not. These accounts demonstrably diverge from the narrative found in the Acts of the Apostles, which itself differs from the depiction presented in the Gospel of Matthew. If you find yourself pondering how to reconcile these discrepancies, rest assured that you are not the first to grapple with this issue. Since antiquity, these variations have been acknowledged, and numerous scholars have endeavored to harmonize these versions, even attempting to merge multiple accounts into a cohesive, singular narrative. Within his own writings, specifically when referencing the versions attributed to Papias, Apollinaris of Laodicea, who cites Papias' accounts, explicitly states that these versions do not contradict the Gospel of Matthew. His rationale for asserting their non-contradictory nature rests on the following point. According to Apollinaris, the Gospel of Matthew merely states that Judas departed with the intention of hanging himself, but it does not definitively confirm that he succeeded in this act. Therefore, Apollinaris proposes that Judas indeed attempted to hang himself, but someone intervened, severing the rope and preventing his death by hanging. Consequently, Judas continued his life, and at a later time, he experienced all the gruesome events described by Papias, including the stoning and other violent occurrences. Similarly, Saint Augustine and Saint Jerome sought to reconcile disparate accounts into a unified narrative. However, the versions they attempted to harmonize were those of Matthew and Acts, suggesting that Judas both hanged himself and was disemboweled, two distinct events. Yet, they did not provide a clear explanation of how these events could be reconciled or occur simultaneously. More recent interpreters have put forth the proposition that Judas may have attempted to hang himself, but the rope snapped, causing him to fall headfirst from a considerable height, resulting in his body rupturing upon impact with the ground. Problem solved, right? Not quite. These proposals are also fraught with difficulties. The primary issue lies in how Judas, initially positioned for hanging, i.e., upright, would have ended up falling headfirst. What force would have caused him to rotate in midair? Furthermore, what is the probability of him finding a branch suitable for hanging that also happened to be situated precisely at the edge of a precipice, ensuring a fall of sufficient height to cause his body to burst open upon impact? The logistics of this particular hanging scenario appear rather intricate. Another point to consider is this: if the complete story were indeed that Judas attempted to hang himself, but the rope broke, leading to his death from the fall rather than the hanging itself, then why does each author only present a partial account? Why does the author of the Gospel of Matthew omit any mention of a fall, and why does the author of the Book of Acts make no reference to a hanging? Today, it is commonplace for these texts to be included within the same volume, i.e., the New Testament. Consequently, a modern reader of the Gospel of Matthew could readily discover the remainder of the story, so to speak, by continuing their reading into the Book of Acts and discovering the details of the fall and bodily rupture. However, it is crucial to remember that originally, for many centuries, even millennia, these texts primarily circulated independently. Not everyone who had access to a copy of Matthew also had access to a copy of Acts. These two books existed separately long before the concept of the New Testament as a unified collection even existed. Originally, these books were not conceived as parts of a single New Testament. Initially, each existed as a separate entity. Subsequently, they were grouped together within a unified collection. Even after this consolidation, an examination of ancient and medieval biblical text manuscripts reveals numerous instances where only the Gospels are present, forming a collection exclusive of the Book of Acts. Consequently, the notion of sequentially reading Matthew, followed by the Book of Acts after the Gospels, was not a widespread practice throughout much of history. There is no compelling evidence to suggest that the author of Acts assumed the reader's prior familiarity with Matthew, or even an intention to read it, or anything similar. To reiterate, these are distinct books penned by different authors, often circulated independently. Furthermore, even if we were to accept this harmonization, which is highly improbable from both a physical and narrative standpoint, a significant problem persists, reconciling the divergent accounts surrounding the naming of the field of blood. Is this designation due to the blood money, the immoral payment Judas returned to the priests? Or does it stem from Judas shedding his blood in that field, after which the priests acquired the land to establish a cemetery? Alternatively, did Judas himself purchase the plot for his own residence? After all, did Judas actually return the money or not? In my perspective, a more straightforward explanation exists for the presence of three distinct narratives concerning Judas's demise. This explanation posits that these disparate books, the Gospel of Matthew and the Book of Acts, were authored by different individuals, each simply relaying varying traditions. Similar to Papias of Hierapolis, diverse versions of Judas's death likely circulated when these texts were composed, with each author recording the version they were familiar with, preferred, or believed to be accurate, assuming they were aware of multiple accounts. Alternatively, it's also plausible that they themselves crafted these versions to underscore a particular theological point or convey a specific message. In the case of Papias's version, for instance, it aligns seamlessly with a tradition of ascribing physically repulsive deaths, characterized by putrid swelling and worms, to figures perceived as antagonists within the sacred narrative. Consequently, they received this exemplary divine punishment, visibly shocking in its nature. Regarding the Gospel of Matthew's account, there might be an underlying intention to connect Judas with Ahithophel, a figure appearing in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Ahithophel was a trusted advisor to King David who ultimately betrayed him, subsequently taking his own life by hanging. Notably, he and Judas, according to Matthew's version, are the only characters depicted in the entire Bible committing suicide in this manner. This suggests the possibility of a deliberate parallel, intentionally drawing connections between the two narratives. By attributing a death to Judas resembling that of David's betrayer, the author reinforces a theologically significant parallel between David and Jesus, portraying Jesus as a sort of new David. As promised at the video's beginning, we now need to address and conclude the discussion surrounding Judas's enigmatic demise, as depicted in the book of Acts, where he falls headfirst and bursts open in the middle. This description is quite puzzling, as the text offers no indication that he fell from a great height or anything of the sort. The popular image of Judas plummeting from a cliff originates from much later sources. The text in Acts simply states that he was in a field when he fell headfirst, and his body ruptured. This scene would make significantly more sense, not necessarily anatomically, but at least narratively, if the author had mentioned that Judas's body was already on the verge of bursting open. For instance, if Judas's body was swollen, rotten, and inflamed, a condition described by Papias, some historians propose that the original text of the book of Acts may have been corrupted, suggesting a problem within the manuscripts. The phrases falling or being head first, represented by prins ginominos, bears a strong resemblance to the phrase being swollen or pressed ginomen. These historians hypothesize that the original text of Acts might have used the latter phrase, which was then corrupted at some point during the manuscript copying process and later recovered. Indeed, historical manuscripts exist that feature the pris ginominos version, incorporating the notion of Judas's swelling into the text of Acts. The issue arises because these texts, which include the variant of Judas swelling, aligning well with Papias's account, date from the 10th century onwards. The oldest available manuscripts of Acts present the falling headfirst version, which may seem less coherent but represents the earliest textual evidence. Therefore, definitively resolving this matter proves challenging. Were scribes in the Middle Ages genuinely correcting the text, altering it from prins ginominos to pressed ginomen, or were they imposing a meaning they believed the text should convey, thereby corrupting the original text? This question remains open within scholarly discussions on the topic. What we can assert with greater certainty is that different versions of Judas's death circulated very early in history. Two of these versions are found in books that would later become part of the New Testament, in addition to Papias's accounts. We could also discuss other, later accounts of Judas's death, such as the version in the Gospel of Nicodemus, which states that Judas hanged himself after God resurrected a chicken that his wife was cooking. Another version appears in the Gospel attributed to Judas himself, where he has a vision that the other disciples would persecute and stone him. However, these are later apocryphal Gospels. I have chosen to primarily focus on the three oldest versions that we have, which include the accounts of hanging, falling headfirst, and swelling until bursting.